Hello, my name is Wendy Adamson, and I am not a curator. I'm a collections manager here at the British Museum, based in the Middle East department, and welcome to my corner. So here in my corner, we are actually in the Asia and Middle East Arms and Armour basement, and we're here today because we're going to talk about firearms. We are not known here at the British Museum for being a military museum, because we're not. But what you may be surprised to know is that we have over 6,000 items of arms and armour, including 135 firearms, which is why I've brought you here. So firearms, even though we don't have a huge amount compared to some other museums, are a really big deal here. The reason they're a really big deal is because some of these bad boys can still cause a lot of injury. Because of that, somebody actually needs to take care of them, take charge of them and organise them, and that person is me. So as a collections manager, I'm responsible for looking after a specific part of the collection, and as I already mentioned, I work in the Middle East department, so that means I get to play with everything that's come from the Middle East from prehistory up to the modern day. We have a mixture of different firearms here at the museum, in all kinds of classifications. We have a lot of antiques. Now an antique is theoretically a firearm that cannot cause a lot of damage in the eyes of the law. We're talking about the things that you would need some match for, and you'd be lighting it, and realistically you'd only get one shot off before you would actually be wrestled to the ground. So in the eyes of the law, it's not really deemed as much as a threat as some others. But we do go on and we have much more modern weapons where you could actually buy ammunition for and you could actually fire them. We also have some that fall into another category, which is a deactivated weapon, which is a firearm that would be, you could buy ammunition for, but it's actually been deactivated to a stage where you can't fire it anymore and is actually deemed safe and doesn't need to be dealt with in the same way. You've probably had enough of hearing me talk about my job and the admin around firearms, so why don't we actually have a look at some guns? So what I brought out first of all are two Matchlock rifles. This one is the oldest one, and this is 18th century, and it's a Turkish style but found in Ethiopia. And a century later we have the Japanese Matchlock, which is much higher quality. What's really interesting is in a lot of the European countries, by the end of the 18th century, matchlocks weren't really being used much. But what's really interesting is these two items are separated by about a century, so you can see how much later the Japanese actually embraced the firearms. But as I say, they really made them so well and they were beautifully decorated. So for anybody who doesn't know, the matchlock mechanism utilises a slow-burning match cord. It still has the ultimate elements of a gun, so you need a projectile, you need a propellant, which is gunpowder, and then you need an ignition source. So with a matchlock, what you have is, these are muzzle loaders, which means you actually load the ammunition into the end. So you would put your propellant, your gunpowder, then you put your lead ball, and then what you do to ignite with a matchlock is you would put a piece of slow-burning match cord into this part of the gun, which is called the serpentine. Now the serpentine is basically a handle which is on a pivot mechanism. So as you actually pull the trigger, it bobs forward and pulls back. As you bob the slow-burning match cord forward, it goes next to the touch hole, which is where your propellant is, hopefully igniting it and causing the gun to fire. By the time we get to the Japanese matchlock, what we have is a proper cocking mechanism called a snap matchlock, where you can cock the item and it is in a ready state until you then pull the trigger. This is Albanian. And it has lots and lots of embellishments. It has a Michele lock, which is very ornately decorated and inscribed. It also has beautiful velvet in its stock, beautiful tassels, and of course you can't help but notice just how many semi-precious stones are actually studded into the entire length of it. Ooh, watch them not sparkle. Now, A flintlock mechanism is very similar to a matchlock in that we still put the propellant and everything into the muzzle end, but our technology has moved on slightly. What we actually have here is a flint, not surprisingly because of the name, and a steel plate. Now the way this creates a spark is when you cock the mechanism, in the dog or cock, which is this area, is where you would clamp the small piece of flint. This plate here is called the frizzen, and this is made of steel. So when we actually fire the mechanism, and you can see that this has a very, very tiny trigger down here, it would cause the dog to strike forward, causing the flint to strike down the steel plate, creating a spark which would then travel into the touch hole and ignite the charge. What we're always curious about though, because this is a non-functioning gun, is if we actually tried to fire it, would all the decoration actually stay put? As part of the training we run here at the British Museum, we do actually learn how to check if an item or a firearm is loaded or not. Part of that with the antique firearms involves pushing a stick down the muzzle and down the barrel to actually see how far it comes down and to see if there is still something blocked up by the touch hole. Whenever we've done it on this weapon, we certainly get residue of gunpowder coming out, so we assume that at some point in the past it was fired and the decoration remained where it was. This has to be, despite its beauty, one of the most impractical weapons I think we have here. So I think this might be more for its looks than its actual practicality. So we'll move on to something a bit more modern now. As part of our Africa collection, we have 3 fairly odd guns. I've got one of them out on the table. Now there's an interesting story behind these 3 firearms, because nobody's entirely sure if they are indeed improvised Kenyan Mau Mau weapons, or if they were made as props for an exhibition when the Museum of Mankind existed over in Burlington Gardens. But what's really interesting is either way, this counts as a deadly weapon and has to be licensed as a shotgun. Now you can see it's a really crudely carved stock. The barrel pretty much just looks like a piece of piping, and the firing mechanism is a wing nut and an elastic band. Now ultimately the nut of the wing nut is replacing the firing pin that you would find in a modern firearm. Now you need a firing pin in a modern firearm because bullets, basically by the time we have a bullet, we have combined all the separate elements of firearms into one handy small capsule. So what you'll find in a bullet is you have your projectile, which is your lead end. You still have your gunpowder or other accelerant in more modern firearms, and you have a primer. The firing pin, or in this case the wing nut, as long as it strikes the bullet at the correct place, it will ignite the accelerant, which will then set off the main charge, which will then fire out the projectile. So what I have here as one of our last guns we'll look at today is a Wild West revolver. Now this isn't a traditional Smith & Wesson, this is actually a Belgian copy, but it still is the same technology. Revolvers always use bullets. You'll be pleased to hear that you don't get them and you don't have to muzzle load them because that would be a lot of hassle. And one of the main differences between a revolver and some of the other guns, even some more modern firearms, is that you don't have the traditional parts. Traditional parts of a gun is always the lock, stock and the barrel, as you may have heard from the film. Whereas with a revolver, almost everything apart from inlay is metal. So apart from more modern repeating firearms, a revolver is the only gun that allows you to shoot more than one round before you need to reload. This is a traditional 5-shot revolver, which means you can get 5 shots off before you need to reload with bullets. So we've collected for various reasons here at the museum. Because we're not a military museum, we're not always interested in the actual technology. It's almost a kind of byproduct. But what we are interested in is that it can tell us something about the time and the people and the culture where it came from. So like this revolver we have, And some of our items have been collected purely for the decorative reasons. So our beautiful Flintlock we saw earlier has many decorative qualities that, for example, our Islamic curators would be very interested in, to see the filigree work and the inlay and the decoration on the, you know, the stock. It's the same with some of the items behind me. You know, the beautiful inlaid mother of pearl and all the other kind of damascening. These are beautiful traits that you find through a lot of other metalwork and a lot of other items. So the reason we've collected them is because they are beautiful and beautiful examples to add to our collection. I really hope you've enjoyed your time down here in the gun store with me. We've looked at 5 different firearms, and I hope you've enjoyed every single one I picked for you. And on behalf of myself and Jeff, we'd like to thank you in advance. And if you would like to watch some more videos, just look under Jeff's feet.